On a cold Yorkshire riverbank, a single man stood between two armies. His name is lost to history. He wielded an axe with one hand and a shield with the other, standing alone on a narrow wooden bridge while hundreds of English soldiers charged toward him. For hours he held them back, when arrows failed, when spears shattered against his shield, when fresh men kept coming, always coming. One soldier finally floated beneath the bridge in a barrel, thrust a spear upward, and ended him. But by then it was too late. The last great Viking invasion of England was already dying. This is the story of Stamford Bridge. September 25th, 1066. The battle that ended an age. The battle that determined the fate of a kingdom. And the battle that, had it gone differently, would have rewritten the entire history of Europe. To understand why one man could hold a bridge against an army, we have to go back. Back to the North Sea. Back to the longships. Back to the last true king of the Vikings, Harald Hardrada. The name means hard ruler, and he earned it. Born in 1015, he was the last Viking king who could claim the legendary spirit of his ancestors. His father was a son of Harald Fairhair. His ancestors had conquered kingdoms, and Harald himself had spent his youth as a mercenary in Constantinople, fighting for the Byzantine emperor, learning the arts of war from the greatest empire on earth. He carried a sword called Turfinger, a weapon worthy of legend. He was tall, fierce, blue-eyed, with a beard that braided when he rode. By 1066, he was 51 years old, at the height of his power, ruling from his throne in Norway. And he wanted England. England in 1066 was vulnerable. King Edward the Confessor had died earlier that year with no clear heir. Harold Godwinson, an English nobleman, had taken the throne, but there were others with claims. Across the North Sea, Harald Hardrada believed he had a rightful claim to the English crown. And he was not the only one who thought so. In Normandy, a man called William the Bastard was also claiming he had a right to England's throne. He was gathering ships, men, and supplies. He was preparing an invasion, but he was not yet ready. In the north of England, another man waited, Tostig Godwinson. He was Harold's own brother, but Harold had stripped him of his earldom. Tostig was bitter, he was vengeful, and he was willing to make a deal with the devil himself. Tostig sailed north to the court of Harald Hardrada. He offered an alliance. He offered his knowledge of England's lands, its armies, its weak points, and Harold, smelling opportunity, accepted. Two exiled men. Two desperate men. Two men who believed they could overthrow the new king of England and claim his throne. In the spring of 1066, Harald Hardrada began preparing his invasion. His shipwrights worked in Oslo and his ports. They built longships, sleek, deadly vessels designed for rivers and open water. These were not the primitive craft of some distant past. These were the product of generations of maritime mastery. Each ship could carry 50 men, and Hardrada was building a fleet of 300 ships. By September, everything was ready. Hardrada stood on a Norwegian shore and looked at his armada. 300 ships, 15,000 men, the largest Viking invasion fleet since the days of Cnut the Great. It was an army built to conquer a kingdom. Banners snapped in the cold northern wind, raven banners, the symbols of the Old Norse gods. Armor gleamed, weapons were sharp, and the men were confident. They had not seen real defeat. They believed themselves invincible. On September 12, 1066, the fleet left Norway. They sailed across the North Sea. They reached the coast of Yorkshire. They landed at the mouth of the Humber River, and they began to march inland. The first resistance came at a place called Gate Fulford, just outside the city of York. The English had sent a force, several thousand men under the command of the northern earls. But these were not hardened veterans. They were militia. They were farmers with spears. They had never faced the organized fury of a professional Viking army. Hardrada's men formed a shield wall and advanced. The English shield wall tried to hold, but the Vikings were stronger, better trained, more experienced. The English line fractured. Men broke and ran. It became a massacre. The English dead numbered in the thousands. The river itself was clogged with bodies. The survivors fled. York surrendered without a fight. Hardrada marched his army to a village called Stamford Bridge, about 20 kilometers north of the city. His men were in high spirits. They had won their first battle without suffering significant casualties. They had proven their dominance. They were the masters of northern England now. On the night of September 24th, Hardrada's army made camp at Stamford Bridge. They had no reason to fear. Harold Godwinson was in the south, presumably defending against William the Conqueror. The English army was hundreds of miles away. The roads north were long. It would take weeks for any organized response to reach them. They could afford to rest, to eat, to enjoy their victory. Some of the men even removed their armor. It was a mild day. They were not expecting immediate combat. The victory at Fulford had made them complacent. Meanwhile, a messenger had reached King Harold. Word of the Viking invasion. Word of the battle at Fulford. Word that his own brother was fighting alongside Hardrada. Harold made a decision that would determine the fate of his kingdom. He ordered his army north. What happened next is almost impossible to comprehend. Harold's army, traveling from southern England, had to cover 185 miles. In 4 days. In 4 days. Think about that for a moment. Medieval armies did not move quickly. Medieval horses had to stop for water and rest. Medieval men marched on foot, in heavy armor carrying weapons. 185 miles in 4 days. That is 46 miles a day. That is a pace that borders on the superhuman. And yet, Harold's army did it. They rode through the night. They forced-marched through days of exhaustion. Men vomited from the exertion. Horses collapsed and were left behind. Blisters opened on feet. Blood soaked through socks. But they did not stop. Harold was a man possessed. He knew that the fate of his kingdom rested on reaching Stamford Bridge before his army became exhausted. He had to arrive, and he had to arrive with enough momentum to defeat Hardrada immediately. By the morning of September 25th, Harold's army had covered nearly the entire distance. They were near Stamford Bridge. They were battered. They were exhausted. But they were there, and they were ready. At dawn, dust clouds appeared on the horizon from the south. Viking sentries reported them to Hardrada. At first, the Norwegian king assumed it was reinforcements. Perhaps Tostig had gathered English levies to join the invasion. The dust clouds grew larger. The sentries became nervous. They realized this was not a reinforcement. This was an army, a massive army, and it was moving toward them at incredible speed. Hardrada's men scrambled. Warriors pulled on armor that had been lying in piles. Shields were grabbed. Weapons were drawn. Some of the Vikings had not even put on their mail coats. Some were still adjusting their helmets as the English appeared. Harold's army arrived at Stamford Bridge at 9 in the morning. For the first time, the two armies saw each other. On one side, the exhausted but disciplined English moving in formation. On the other side, the Vikings, still disorganized, still scrambling to prepare, but utterly confident in their ability to destroy this force that had appeared before them. Hardrada rode forward on his horse. He was a commanding figure, tall, powerful, with the bearing of a king. He raised his sword and began to rally his men. There was no time to form a perfect shield wall. There was no time for tactics. Both armies could see each other. Both armies knew that blood was about to be spilled. The Vikings began to form a crescent formation, a shape designed to maximize their defensive strength. It was a desperate tactic. They were outnumbered. Most accounts suggest Harold had between 10 and 20,000 men. Hardrada had perhaps 9,000 fit for combat. The Vikings needed to use the terrain. They needed to fight defensively. They needed to hold until somehow, some miracle would turn the tide. And then Harold gave the order. The English advanced. What happened next would be remembered for centuries. Because standing at the narrow point of Stamford Bridge, the actual bridge that gave the battle its name, was a single Viking warrior. Counts vary on his identity. Some said he was a Beserker, a warrior devoted to the Old Norse god Odin. Some said he was simply a warrior of extraordinary skill and ferocity. But what all accounts agree on is that he was almost impossibly difficult to kill. This bridge was narrow, perhaps 12 feet wide. Only a few men could attack him at once, and he had made himself into a human blockade. He was enormous, taller than the men around him, broader in the shoulders. His shield was dented from countless impacts. His axe was stained with blood, and his eyes held a kind of terrible focus. This was not a man fighting for escape. This was not a man hoping to survive. This was a man who had decided that he would make the English pay for every inch of ground. The English sent men forward to cross the bridge. The Berserker killed the first one. His axe came down in a terrible arc, and the English soldier's shield splintered. The man fell, screaming, and the Berserker pushed his body aside with his boot, crushing him beneath his weight. More English came forward. The Berserker was impossibly fast. His axe swung left, then right, then left again. An English spear came at him, and he deflected it. A sword thrust toward his face, and he parried it. He was wounded, blood ran down his side, but he did not slow. He did not surrender. He did not yield an inch. The English tried to push across the bridge in a rush. The Berserker stood his ground and fought. Arrows flew from English bows. They struck him in the shoulder, in the leg, but he did not fall. He just screamed. A sound that witnesses said was like the roar of an animal, and swung his axe even harder. Time became strange on that bridge. Could have been minutes, could have been hours. All anyone knew was that one man, alone, held back the entire English army. And then the English changed their tactics. Someone, history does not record his name, realized that the bridge could not be crossed while the Berserker stood. So he found a barrel, a wooden barrel big enough for a man to fit inside. He hid inside that barrel and drifted downriver, beneath the bridge, until he was directly below the Berserker. The warrior was still fighting above, still screaming, still swinging his axe. The man in the barrel thrust his spear upward, through the wooden planks of the bridge, searching for the Berserker's body. The spear found flesh, found vital organs. The Berserker looked down in shock. His strength had been extraordinary, but his body was still only human. He had been wounded a dozen times. He had been shot with arrows. He had been stabbed from above and below. For the first time, he staggered. The English sensed it and surged forward. The Berserker tried to raise his axe one more time, but his strength was failing him. He fell backward, off the bridge into the river below. His body sank. The bridge was clear. The English poured across. With the bridge secured, the real battle could finally begin. Harold's army swept forward in a coordinated advance. The Vikings, now with nowhere left to fall back to, had to fight or die. Hardrada was in the thick of it. He was not a king who sent other men to die in his place. He rode at the head of his warriors, his sword flashing, his shield raised. He had learned the art of war in Constantinople. He had fought the Seljuk Turks. He had stood in the bodyguard of Byzantine emperors. He knew tactics. He knew the rhythm of battle. But even Hardrada could not overcome the weight of numbers and the momentum of the English advance. The Viking formations were breaking apart. Men were falling. The careful defensive crescent was collapsing. And then an arrow found Hardrada. It struck him in the neck, severing something vital. The last great king of the Vikings fell from his horse. Men rushed to defend him. Tostig fought at his side, trying to protect his dying ally. But it was too late. Hardrada died there on the field, surrounded by his enemies, his reign ending not in triumph but in defeat. With their king dead, some of the Vikings tried to rally. Tostig screamed orders. He tried to organize a counterattack. He wanted to push back the English, to buy time for the Vikings to regroup, to find some way to turn the battle. But the men's hearts were no longer in it. They had come to conquer. They had ended up dying. The English continued to press forward. By midday, it was clear that the Vikings had lost. The crescent formation had been broken entirely. Survivors were trying to flee. Some made for the river. The water was cold, the banks slippery with mud and blood. Men drowned trying to cross. The river became clogged with bodies. Some Vikings tried to organize a last stand in a nearby field. They formed a shield wall, surrounded on three sides by English forces. It was hopeless. They were massacred. When it was over, only a handful of Vikings remained alive, and most of them were dying from their wounds. The battle lasted from 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. 6 hours. 6 hours of continuous combat. 6 hours of English soldiers grinding down the Viking army through sheer superior numbers and relentless pressure. When the sun began to set on Stamford Bridge, the Vikings who had sailed from Norway with such confidence were almost entirely gone. Of the 300 ships that had carried them, only 24 would make the journey home. Only 24 out of 300. Nearly 15,000 men had sailed from Norway. Fewer than 3,000 survived. But the tragedy of Stamford Bridge does not end there, because King Harold could not rest. Even as his men were removing armor and tending to wounds, messengers arrived with terrible news. 3 weeks earlier, William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast of England. He had a fleet. He had an army. He was claiming the throne of England for himself. Harold had a choice. He could rest his army in the north, let them recover from their ordeal, and then march south slowly. Or he could take his exhausted men south immediately to face William. He chose to march south immediately. The same army that had force-marched 185 miles in 4 days and then fought an entire battle now had to march south another 100 miles to face a new enemy. They were exhausted. They were hungry. They were traumatized by combat. Some were wounded. Many would not reach the south in time. And when Harold's army finally faced William at a place called Hastings, it was not the full force that had been at Stamford Bridge. Many men had fallen behind. Many had decided they could not continue. The army that Harold brought to Hastings was weaker than the one he had commanded in the north. On October 14, 1066, Harald Godwinson died at the Battle of Hastings, shot through the eye by a Norman archer. England's new king was dead, and William the Conqueror took the throne. The single berserker on the bridge at Stamford Bridge, the man whose name we do not know, had held back an entire army for a crucial moment. But that moment was not enough. The cascade of events had already been set in motion. One great battle had been won, but the war for England had been lost. With Stamford Bridge, the age of the Vikings had come to an end. No more would great fleets sail from Scandinavia to conquer European kingdoms. No more would Viking kings claim crowns. The world was changing. Christianity was spreading. Feudalism was solidifying. The old way of the Norsemen was dying. Hardrada's grave lay somewhere on the fields near Stamford Bridge. He had come to claim a throne and instead found death. He had brought the largest Viking invasion fleet in centuries and ended up with only 24 ships returning home. He had believed himself invincible, and he had learned, too late, that all men are mortal. The berserker's body was never identified. It sank in the river and disappeared into history, but his stand on that bridge became legend. In later centuries, poets would write about him. Skalds would sing songs about his defiance. He became a symbol of Viking ferocity, of the refusal to surrender even when defeat was inevitable. One man against an army, one man holding a bridge, one man making his enemies pay in blood for every step forward. That image, that single figure standing alone with an axe and a shield, would outlive empires. It would outlive kingdoms. It would become immortal. But the victory on that bridge meant nothing in the end. Harald Godwinson and his exhausted army had won. They had held England against the last great Viking invasion. But they had no time to celebrate, no time to rest, no time to prepare. And when they marched south to face William the Conqueror, they marched knowing that one more battle awaited them. And that battle would change everything. On September 25, 1066, the last great age of the Vikings came to an end on a wooden bridge in Yorkshire. It did not end with 1,000 ships landing on a coast. It did not end with the sacking of a great city. It ended with a single man holding a bridge against an army, and his name lost to history. It ended with a king dying from an arrow to the neck. It ended with an invasion defeated and a prophecy fulfilled. The world had changed, and England would never be the same.